Emmett Till was just 14 years old in the summer of 1955. Born and raised in Chicago, he was a lively, charismatic boy known for his sense of humor and contagious energy. He loved baseball, telling jokes, and spending time with his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, who worked tirelessly to provide a good life for him. His mother worked long hours as a clerk for the U.S. Air Force, ensuring Emmett never lacked the essentials. He was independent, intelligent, and deeply loved by those around him. Emmett had grown up in an environment that, while not free from racism, was significantly different from the Jim Crow South. Chicago had segregated neighborhoods, schools, and social establishments, but it was also a place where black families could own businesses, access better education, and avoid the immediate threats of lynching that plagued the South. This relative freedom shaped Emmett's personality. He was confident, outgoing, and playful. However, his mother was well aware of the dangers lurking beyond their northern home. She often shared stories with Emmett about how different life was in the South, where the smallest perceived slight against a white person could lead to deadly consequences. Despite these warnings, Emmett, like many boys his age, had a sense of invincibility. He was excited about his upcoming trip to visit his great-uncle, Mose Wright, in Money, Mississippi, eager for adventure and the chance to experience life in the rural South. Before he left, Mamie Till Mobley sat him down for a serious conversation. She gave him specific instructions: avoid eye contact with white people, never speak to white women, and always show the utmost deference to any white authority figures. These were not lessons in respect, but rather lessons in survival. Though Emmett listened, he did not truly grasp the weight of her words. When Emmett arrived in Money, Mississippi, he was eager to explore. The town was small, a stark contrast to the bustling streets of Chicago. His great-uncle, Mose Wright, was a sharecropper, and Emmett quickly became aware of the harsh realities of rural black life in the South. Fields stretched for miles, with black families working from dawn till dusk for minimal wages. Unlike Chicago, where black men and women had some degree of economic mobility, Money was a place where white landowners controlled almost every aspect of life. On August 24, 1955, Emmett and his cousins went to Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market. It was a small, dusty store run by Roy and Carolyn Bryant, catering mostly to black sharecroppers. The store was one of the few places black residents could buy food and household supplies. Yet they were expected to maintain strict deference to the white owners. Accounts of what happened inside the store vary. Some say Emmett whistled at Carolyn Bryant. Others say he simply smiled. Some suggest he made a playful comment, unaware of the rigid racial boundaries of the South. Whatever the truth, what happened inside Bryant's grocery would seal his fate. As soon as Emmett and his cousins realized they may have crossed a dangerous line, they ran out of the store and sped away. The fear set in immediately. They knew that breaking the unspoken racial codes of the South could have deadly consequences. That night, they spoke about the incident in hushed voices, hoping it would be forgotten. But none of them, least of all Emmett, expected what was coming next. To fully understand the gravity of Emmett's actions, one must grasp the deep-seated racism ingrained in the culture of the Jim Crow South. Unlike the North, where racism often manifested in systemic and economic oppression, the South upheld a violent, openly racist hierarchy where black people were considered inferior in every aspect of life. Black people were expected to be subservient to whites, and any deviation from this unwritten rule could be met with swift and brutal retaliation. A simple act, like looking a white person in the eye for too long or failing to step off the sidewalk to let them pass, could provoke violence. White men had long used allegations of black men making advances toward white women as an excuse for lynchings and other forms of racial terror. For a young boy like Emmett, raised in a more progressive northern city like Chicago, these rules were not only foreign but seemed absurd. He did not have the deeply ingrained fear that many black Southerners carried as a means of survival. His actions at the store were not intended to be defiant, rather, they were the innocent gestures of a child unfamiliar with the dangers lurking in the South. But in 1955 Mississippi, innocence did not matter. The mere suggestion that a black boy had disrespected a white woman was enough to seal his fate. In the early morning hours of August 28, 1955, The stillness of the night was shattered by a loud knock on the door of Mose Wright's cabin. The small home, nestled in the rural Mississippi Delta, suddenly felt unbearably exposed. Outside, standing in the darkness, were Roy Bryant and his half-brother J.W. Milam, both armed and seething with rage. Their voices carried a sinister undertone as they demanded to see the boy who done it. Mose Wright, a man in his 60s, knew there was little he could do against two armed white men. Terrified, he tried to reason with them, even offering them money in the desperate hope that they would leave without harming Emmett. But Bryant and Milam had already made up their minds. They pushed past Wright and stormed inside, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Emmett, groggy from sleep, barely had time to react. The men shined a flashlight directly in his face. "You the one did the talking at the store?" Milam asked coldly. Emmett, still confused and half awake, shook his head. But Bryant and Milam weren't looking for explanations. They grabbed him by the arm and dragged him out of bed. The young boy barely had time to put on his shoes before being yanked into the humid Mississippi night. His great-aunt Elizabeth Wright clutched onto Mose's arm, whispering prayers under her breath, while his cousins huddled in fear. As Emmett was pulled through the doorway, he turned back for a final glance at his family. His eyes held fear, but also defiance, as Bryant and Milam shoved Emmett into the back of a pickup truck. The dust from the dirt road billowed into the air, creating a choking cloud. The vehicle sped off into the night, heading away from the town and deeper into the Delta's darkened landscape. The men had no intention of letting Emmett go. To them, this wasn't just about punishing a boy for allegedly disrespecting a white woman. It was about enforcing the unspoken laws of white supremacy in the Jim Crow South. For hours, Emmett was terrorized. He was driven from one location to another, while Bryant and Milam debated what to do with him. Along the way, they picked up other men, some of whom laughed and joked about what was about to happen. Others remained silent, aware that what they were partaking in was something monstrous, but unwilling to intervene. They took him to a barn first, beating him mercilessly. Milam struck him with a pistol, the cold steel cracking against the boy's skull. Blood dripped down his face. But still, Emmett refused to beg for his life. The men grew angrier. "Ain't you scared?" one of them barked. But Emmett, with all the courage of a boy who still believed in justice, answered, "You're not going to do anything to me. I haven't done anything wrong." The torture continued. They gouged out one of his eyes. They stripped him naked, taunting and humiliating him. They forced him to carry a 75-pound cotton gin fan, tying it around his neck with barbed wire. By then, the boy could barely stand. His body was battered, swollen, and bleeding, but he refused to cry. Realizing that Emmett was still alive despite the unimaginable suffering, they decided to finish it. They took him to the edge of the Tallahatchie River, where the muddy waters flowed eerily under the moonlight. Bryant and Milam, still fuming with rage, pointed a gun to Emmett's head. And then, in a final act of merciless brutality, they pulled the trigger. His lifeless body collapsed into the river, the cotton gin fan ensuring that he would sink beneath the surface. The men watched for a moment before driving away, believing they had erased their crime. What they didn't know was that they had just ignited a fire that would never be extinguished. 3 days after Emmett Till's disappearance, a fisherman on the Tallahatchie River stumbled upon a gruesome sight: a bloated, mutilated body, barely recognizable as human. The stench of decay filled the air as authorities were called to the scene. The body was pulled from the water, revealing horrific injuries. His face was unrecognizable. One of his eyes had been gouged out, and the barbed wire that bound the cotton gin fan to his neck had left deep lacerations. It was clear that his murderers had intended to erase any trace of his identity. Back in Chicago, Mamie Till Mobley received the devastating news. Her world collapsed. She had held on to hope that her son would be found alive. But now she was faced with the unimaginable horror of bringing his broken body home. The shock was unbearable, but despite her immense grief, she made a decision that would alter the course of history. She insisted on an open-casket funeral. "Let the world see what they did to my boy," she declared. Thousands of mourners poured into Chicago's Roberts Temple Church of God in Christ, their eyes widening in shock and disbelief as they gazed upon Emmett's disfigured face. The brutality was undeniable. Jet magazine published photos of Emmett's corpse, and for the first time, Millions of Americans, black and white, were confronted with the raw, unfiltered horror of racial violence. The images sent shockwaves across the country, sparking national outrage. People who had ignored the brutal realities of segregation could no longer look away. Emmett Till Mobley had turned her personal tragedy into a powerful statement, one that would fuel the flames of the burgeoning civil rights movement. Despite overwhelming evidence, the trial of Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam was a mockery of justice from the start. The courtroom in Sumner, Mississippi, was packed, but not with impartial jurors. The jury consisted of 12 white men, a grim reminder of the South's deep-seated racial injustice. Mose Wright, Emmett's great-uncle, risked his life by taking the stand, pointing directly at Bryant and Milam, and identifying them as the men who took Emmett that night. His voice, steady despite the danger, echoed through the tense courtroom. It was a historic moment, a black man testifying against white men in a Southern courtroom. But the outcome was never in doubt. The defense painted Emmett as the aggressor, playing into the deeply ingrained stereotypes of black men as threats to white women. Carolyn Bryant, the woman at the center of the case, took the stand, weaving a story about how Emmett had supposedly grabbed her and made lewd remarks. Decades later, she would admit she had lied. The jury deliberated for just 67 minutes before delivering their verdict, not guilty. One juror later admitted, "It wouldn't have taken us that long if we hadn't stopped to drink soda." Bryant and Milam smirked in the courtroom. They had gotten away with murder. A few months later, protected by double jeopardy laws, Bryant and Milam sold their confession to Look magazine for $4. They openly admitted to torturing and killing Emmett Till, knowing they could never be retried. "We just wanted to teach him a lesson," Milam said, boasting about the crime. The cold-blooded confession stunned the nation, further igniting demands for justice. The injustice was staggering. Emmett's life had been stolen. His killers had walked free. And the system had once again failed black Americans. But something had changed. The world had seen the brutality of racism up close. And the civil rights movement had gained its martyr. Though Emmett Till's murderers walked free, his death ignited something in America. Just a few months later, Rosa Parks would cite Emmett Till when she refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. His brutal death became a rallying cry for justice, fueling the momentum of the civil rights movement. The images of Emmett's disfigured face lingered in the minds of those fighting for equality. His mother, Emmett Till Mobley, became an outspoken activist, traveling the country to share his story. The NAACP used Emmett's case to expose the horrors of racial violence, ensuring that his name would never be forgotten. The movement gained traction, leading to landmark legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Emmett's story became a symbol of the fight against racial injustice, a reminder of how one tragedy could spark massive social change. Decades later, Emmett Till's story still resonates. His murder helped lay the groundwork for major legislative changes. But the fight for racial justice is far from over. Hate crimes, racial profiling, and systemic discrimination still plague the country, making Emmett's story as relevant today as it was in 1955. In 2022, after years of activism and demands for change, the U.S. government finally passed the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, making lynching a federal hate crime. This long-overdue legislation stands as a testament to the enduring power of his story and the importance of continued advocacy for civil rights. However, his story is not just about the past. It is a lesson for the present and future, a warning about what happens when hatred is left unchecked and a call to action for those who believe in justice. Epilogue. Remember his name. The murder of Emmett Till was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point for America. A nation that had tolerated racism for centuries was forced to confront its demons. The brutality inflicted upon him exposed the deep rot of racial hatred and sparked a movement that would transform the country. Today, as we continue to fight for racial justice, Emmett's story serves as a painful reminder of the cost of silence and the power of truth. His legacy is carried on by activists, educators, and all who seek a more just world. Because of Emmett Till Mobley's bravery, the world saw what hate could do, and it refused to look away. His name is Emmett Till, and we will never forget.